My name's Tony Platt. I just finished this book, Beyond These Walls, Rethinking Crime and Punishment in the United States. It's a book that looks very deeply at the history of carceral issues in the United States and how we got to this horrendous place that we're in now. It also asks us to look very broadly at issues beyond police and prisons, to also look at welfare, immigration, the conditions that poor women and families face. And it also tries to come up with some bold, imaginative thinking for what we're going to have to do to change this, change the current situation. So in terms of the history, we all know about what's sometimes called the distant present, all the events of the last 20 or 30 years, over-incarceration, police killing of people on the streets, detention of immigrants, massive deportation, particularly of people from Mexico. We know all about that. But in general, we don't have a clear, long view of how we got to this place. And so one of the things that I argue in Beyond These Walls is that we need to see the deep connections between the long history of racism and class oppressions in the criminal justice system that have taken place right back to the beginning of the professionalization of policing, the rise of the modern prison system, the development of immigration policies, and so on. Those are all interrelated. So that's one set of arguments. Another set of arguments is that while the urban police and prisons play a critically important role in reproducing inequality and maintaining inequality, there are many other institutions that are involved. And I think we need a broad view of those institutions. The welfare system, often the school system that tracks poor kids into a life of carceral futures, public health systems that in the past rounded up and sterilized thousands and thousands of women before and after World War II, campaigns to take the homeless and beggars off the streets of major cities today, and to do this without trial and without hearings. So I think there's a much larger set of issues beyond policing and prison and beyond what we normally think of as crime. And obviously, we have to focus and speak out against the long history of institutionalized racism. African Americans in particular have always been at the center of who gets victimized by the carceral state. But I also wanted people to understand that the carceral state can be very prolific and quite promiscuous in terms of its reach. And there's many other populations that have come under its guard and its scrutiny. If you look at the photographs in the book, the first image on the first page of the inserted photographs is of Native American young men and women in these residential boarding schools. And I think people picking up a book whose subtitle is Rethinking Crime and Punishment might be surprised about that. But I think we often tell certain histories, in this case the history of Native Americans and what happened to them, separate from other histories. And it's not seen as a part of the carceral history or the imprisonment history of the United States. So I wanted people to understand how the reservation, as it developed in the 19th century, is a carceral form of containment of people. Well, to speak about the injustices of the current American carceral state would probably take a few weeks here. But I think there are many fundamental injustices of it. The major one, I think, is the way in which people who've been charged with corporate crimes or economic crimes, or government officials who've been charged with crimes, get tracked out of the criminal justice system for the most part. Now, occasionally, corporate criminals end up in prison. It is so rare an occurrence that people are shocked when it happens and the media covers it. But for the most part, corporate criminals like big banks that have committed frauds and criminal behavior against clients, as we've seen in the last 10 years. Many banks have been involved in that, laundering money for cartels, cheating people into signing up for things that they didn't want, and so on. That invariably, the people who are involved in those kinds of crimes get tracked out of the criminal justice system and have to make a financial settlement. And it's usually a financial settlement that is a tiny part of their profits and their earnings, and which is not really a serious consequence. It doesn't affect their social life. It doesn't affect their civil rights. It doesn't create a civil death for them as it does for most people who are incarcerated and doing time. It doesn't follow them around for the rest of their life in the way that people who have records get followed for the rest of their life. And I think that's a fundamental injustice. If you're going to talk about criminal justice system that deals with crime, punishes people fairly and equally, then I think it should be across the board. And I think also if we had more corporate criminals in prison and jail, we would see prison reform happen very, very quickly. My career as an academic and then my long-time activism are interrelated. And in the early days of being an activist, I worked a lot in different kinds of reform campaigns, thinking that it would be possible to make some significant changes. And I think the defeat of those programs and the limits of those programs and the setbacks of those reforms then led me to have a more radical and holistic view about the nature of American society and what needed to be done. So early on, for example, I supported the idea of young people arrested for delinquency to have lawyers defend them in court, which until the 60s, young people were denied legal representation. And I thought that would give them a fairer shake in court and also would protect the ideas of justice and fairness and so on. But the outcome of that is that most of the lawyers working for young people in the courts ended up speeding up the guilty process, ended up working with other court officials and the court bureaucracy to basically get people to plead guilty and to end up doing time and going into detention and reformatories. Or another example is that I worked in the 70s on campaigns for civilian review of the police, and many places in the United States then set up civilian review boards, which then did, hear complaints against the police and did discipline them or in some few cases fire them. But it didn't change the underlying structures and policies and militarism of policing. And I felt it after a while that was just a very inadequate way to change the nature of policing or what the police do. So those would be two examples of reforms that were undermined in practice that led me to think more deeply and widely about what the problems are. So one of the critiques that I have of criminal justice reforms is that too often we're faced with the Sophies Choice. Should we provide services and programs and special treatment for people inside who've been convicted of nonviolent crimes and help them to maybe reduce their time in prison and get out earlier? But then what happens to all the other people that stay in prison? What about the people in their 20s that used a knife or a gun and were engaged in a violent crime when they were very young and have now been there for 10, 15, 20 years? What about people who've done time for serious drug offenses when they were young, but now this is a long time ago and they've changed and so on? I think that's a horrible choice. Like, should we just defend this small part of the prison system and abandon everybody else? And you see it also in campaigns to provide a path to citizenship for the dreamers, the so-called DACA, the people that came to the United States as the children of undocumented immigrants and are somehow blameless because they came here as children. There's been a lot of talk over the last 10 years to try to figure out a way that they could have a path through education or jobs or the military to citizenship. But at the same time, the millions of other people who came here undocumented, who live in the United States for many, many years, who have families here, whose children went to school here, who have roots here, the implication being that they're fair game for ICE or for being deported or for being put in prison or detention. I think too often criminal justice reformers are faced with these kinds of dilemmas. I'm hoping that the book that I've written that comes out of a lot of my experiences that I had in the 60s and 70s and issues that I've thought about in the present as well. I hope it helps develop an intergenerational conversation between activists and reformers today and my generation that did this kind of work then. Because I don't think there's enough communication about what we learned, what we experienced, what we did wrong, what gave us hope, what gave us pessimism. I don't think we have enough of those conversations. So one of the things the book I hope the book will do is to create the grounds for that conversation.